Our guest today is Crispin Elsted, who, along with his wife Jan, is Barbarian Press, and they live in Mission, BC. So he's come quite a long way to talk to us today. And he's a man of many parts. He's a topographer, a musician, a poet, and numerous other things. So he's a Renaissance man in a modern world. And his talk today is going to be the state of the art and the state of the market, the private press today. And he's going to be referring, among other things, from his book, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, Climate and Affectations, and he will be using this as an example in his talk. I would like to have all of you please welcome Crispin.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I'll refer to this, but it is for sale. There is reference to the marketplace. If anyone would like to buy a copy, there's one here. I need to begin with a few provisos or prevarications or warnings or something. This talk is a kind of ricochet from some work I've been doing to prepare a course for Simon Fraser University, which I'm teaching in May, on literate book design. You understand that these things are sometimes mutually exclusive. And the course is meant to address that. And when Anne called and asked me if I'd speak to Cabbage members today, it seemed to be sensible to say something about the same field because it was something that was much on my mind. The difficulty is that I've spent the last month or so preparing this course, and I have roughly 50 times as much material as I can possibly cover in 45 minutes. So I'm reminded of T.M. Cleland's remarks to the Grolier Club in about 1940 when he was giving a speech, and he said, if typography and printing is one small twig on a small branch on the large tree which is cultural history, that he would be seen to appear rather like a monkey leaping from branch to branch all over the tree for the next hour. And I think I'll be doing much the same thing, if perhaps with less grace. But if it seems that my thinking is perhaps more lateral than it is sensible, you can always remember that trees have roots, and you can go down to the bottom and start up on your own, and maybe you'll find out where I am. I'm somewhere up in the superstructure. So, private press printing in the marketplace, these are two things which are rarely discussed together. And part of my concern in talking about them today is to try to isolate what some of the difficulties are, both for private press printers generally trying to make some kind of a living at making books today, and for publishers of literature. Now, publishing, of course, is a huge industry, and I'm not interested in talking about the commercial publishing of things like what we call coffee table books, scholarly books which are used for texts, or anything like that. I'm talking specifically about what might loosely be referred to as belles lettres, literature, poetry, short essays, novels, that kind of thing. Because to the degree that the private press world of publishing has anything to do with the commercial world, the overlap is essentially there. And I think we have to begin with a few definitions. We've come thus far, I think we could loosely say 100 years since the beginning of the modern private press movement. The Kelmscott Press was founded by William Morris in 1889, so we're just over 100 years past that. And Morris died 100 years ago last year. And it was the Kelmscott Press, although there had been other private presses earlier, like the Daniel Press and the Strawberry Hill Press, notably. The Kelmscott Press was the one which really gave the impetus for what has become the modern press movement, and resulted, or at least gave inspiration to later presses like the Doves and Ashendene and Vale presses in England, and subsequently to the Grabhorn Press, the Marymount Press, and so on in the States, and to private presses in Canada and all over the world, not only in the English-speaking world, of course, although that's the area that I'll be referring to most often. We've gone through this 100 years with various ups and downs, and for most of that time, those of us who were interested in letterpress printing were fairly comfortable with what was happening in the commercial world. First of all, for at least the first half of that time, letterpress printing was still an active part of commercial printing. Now, of course, that's no longer the case. And since the technology of commercial printing has moved away from letterpress and from relief printing, private presses have in one sense been entrapped and in another sense been freed. They've been entrapped because they're caught, as it were, in an old technology. And the marketplace governing production, it's very difficult nowadays to find type, to find proper papers for letterpress printing, or to find binders, if you're not binding yourself, who will produce small enough editions of edition binding to make it financially worthwhile for a private press. On the other hand, they've been emancipated, I think, in the same sense that painting might be said to have been emancipated at the end of the 19th century by the camera, in that the development of computer types, or first of all film set type and offset printing, and then computer digitalized type, has meant that an enormous amount of letterpress equipment has become available that wasn't perhaps available before. We now have, as well as private presses, a good many private type foundries, and of course small private paper mills as well. And the book has, in a sense, been freed as a form from the necessity of, or the private press book at least, has been freed from the necessity of having to be a major purveyor of text for the reading public. Now, I say that with some reservations, and I'll get to those reservations later. But there is a kind of freedom in that developed technology. But I think we haven't asked often enough just what a book is. I mean, it's the sort of thing that everyone knows what a book is, so why bother talking about it? But the essences and the characteristics of the book as it's come down to us from roughly the Renaissance is something we don't really spend very much time thinking about. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about that. I'm taking the book, by the way, to mean the codex, that is the thing with leaves which you turn, rather than the scroll or any other form of book. And the book itself, as a conveyor of matter, I'm not going to say information, but matter, is something which was developed really as a Renaissance I suppose, ideal. Before that, the book was a manuscript book. The large illuminated manuscripts which were done in monastery scriptoria through the Middle Ages, and the books which come down to us in other forms before that, were by their nature completions within themselves. If you see a psalter or a Bible or a collection of devotional poetry, these are most often being the subjects of medieval manuscripts, you find in it a work of art which is created and completed in some way by one or a number of scribes. You also see an object which has an innate and very sensible beauty. Manuscript usually had, apart from the beauty of the lettering itself, usually had illuminations of some kind, gilding, decoration, which was in itself both an echoing of the text and of the reaction of the script to the text, and a thing for a decoration for its own sake. The fact that human beings have always liked decoration, have always liked to have some kind of ornamentation on things which they value, seems both a psychological necessity and a cultural truth. But when the Renaissance began to develop movable type and paper began to be produced in such a way that books could be printed, and the printing press was developed in various ways, you began to have a new kind of object, a new sort of ideal developing. And the book, the printed book, even the earliest and most magnificent of them, say for example the Gutenberg Bible, is notably different from the manuscript book. It's different, first of all, because it's mass-produced in some measure, and secondly because at that time, although the intent naturally of the printed book was to take the manuscript as its model and to attempt in a way to recreate the manuscript in mass, to the eyes of people at the time, there must have been a vast difference between a manuscript that was written by hand and illuminated and gilded and a printed book. No matter how beautiful the printed book, that distinction would have been very clear. Much clearer than it probably is to us now if we see two of them side by side in a library or a collection. The process of creating the modern, what I'll call the modern book, the book which ends up with something like this, is a process of developing a critical and utilitarian apparatus around the text of the book. People like Simon de Colline and Aldus Manutius and the other great early printers began to develop things like title pages, contents pages, indexes, appendixes, chapter headings, subheadings, all kinds of apparatus which allowed us to steer our way through the book. And to that extent, the book became a kind of machine for knowing. The things that were put in around the text, the main content of the book, became elements of its use. And the refinements of those things, the refinements of things like an index, like a table of contents, even like dedications and title pages, were refinements which clearly distinguished over time the book, the printed book, from the manuscript and made it quite a new thing. Now, that development, which leads to the modern book we have today, is something which tends to get glossed over. Most of us, when we read a modern book, we know that it has a table of contents, we know there may be footnotes and so forth. We refer to them when we need them, but we don't think about them. And I think our appreciation of the book as a cultural unit, as an object which has real use and a tremendous intellectual flexibility, is something we take far too much for granted. Private press books, by their nature, tend to have that kind of apparatus too, although not always. And I think in discarding the book rather randomly, as we are in the process of doing with the advent of computers, we're probably throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because the computer book or the digitalized book doesn't have the same kind of referential apparatus that a book has. It has certainly apparatus to find things. You can punch in a keyword and hit it, and it'll list every example in the book of that word. But those have their own problems. Mostly, I think, of quantity. There is so much flexibility in a digitalized book, and I'm calling it a book only with quotation marks around it. There's so much flexibility in such a text that it's difficult to know where to start. The opportunities for finding things out are so vast that you very often, I in any case, very often find myself standing in front of a computer scratching my head wondering what I should look up next, when what I really want to do is read the text. Everything else seems to get in the way. So the book is, I think, a Renaissance creation, and I want to talk about it in those terms today. Secondly, in terms of the private press, I would like to say a little bit about publishing. It's notable that when people talk about being private press persons, they usually call themselves private press printers. They rarely call themselves private press publishers. It's odd that that word doesn't come up more often, because in fact what private presses are doing is publishing, even if they're only publishing small editions. And publishing is a responsibility as well as a privilege and something one can enjoy. And over the years, private press publishing, I think, has divided itself rather neatly into three fairly specific areas, at least for terms of discussion. And in no particular order, I would say that these are, first of all, what we would now refer to as the book art book, often one of a kind, but sometimes very small editions in which the structure of the book has been in some way addressed or experimented with often. Often the subject of the book is graphic rather than textual. That is, typically you'll find a book with a lot of plates, a lot of illustrative material, and often the typography itself, if there is any, and there may not always be type, is used illustratively, is manipulated on the page, printed in several colors, moved around and made to rejoice in its own being in a way, but also in a way which tends to obfuscate reading, to make the text sometimes difficult to arrive at. I refuse to say difficult to access. It's a verb I hate. So that might be one level or one part of private press publishing. Another part, which I think is up until about the last 10 or 15 years has been the biggest part of private press publishing, is simply the book as text, the literary book. Books where the text was clearly the main reason for the publication, where the object of the printer is to get the text out to a public and to make it readable, but at the same time to make it beautiful, to draw attention to the typography, to the paper that's used, to the binding, to whatever design elements the printer might himself bring to it, and therefore to, at the best, to glorify the text, to give the text a kind of resonance visually that it might not otherwise have. And the third kind of private press publishing, which is not usually ever discussed in these terms, is what I would call polemical publishing. The best example of it would be the publishing of samizdat books in the old Soviet Union, or in any country where there's a great deal of repression, and people hand sometimes only single copies of typed or carbon copies of manuscript around so that people can read them, often under threat of imprisonment or even worse. And this is decidedly a kind of publishing, and a very useful one, and as many of you know, I'm sure, some of the greatest poetry which has come out of the Eastern Bloc countries in the last 50 years was published in such a way. The poems of Osip Mandelstam, for example, but many others too. Much of Akhmatova's poetry was also produced in that way. And about 10 years ago, Jan and I came quite forcibly into contact with this when we published a collection of poems by Jan Kaplinski, the Estonian poet. And in talking to Jan about this whole process and working with his translator here, Sam Hamill, there actually on the Pacific coast, we discovered that in order for Sam and Jan to collaborate on this process of translation, because Jan was still in Estonia, they had to correspond in classical Chinese, which it happened they both knew, because they knew that the Russian guards wouldn't understand it, so they just passed the letter on. But if they had written in either Estonian, well, which Sam's Estonian was not wonderful, he was working from trots that Kaplinski provided him, but if they had written in either Estonian or English, then the guards would have been onto what they were doing, and Jan would have been in trouble yet again, because he made almost a career of getting into trouble with the authorities. And much of his poetry, much of the poetry that we put in this book, had appeared only in the form of single type sheets handed around to friends in the Estonian Republic. So it's a very important part of publishing. It exists too, although not under anything like such threat, here in our culture. Recently, well, 20 years ago, but when you're 50, 20 years ago isn't very long. Recently in London, I bought a copy of a lecture by Louis Zukowski, which was given at the American Embassy in the mid-60s, which someone had transcribed rather hastily, typed up, mimeographed, and stapled into a really dreadful pink card wrapper, and sold for 50 pence. They had about 10 copies of it at this shop in the 1970s, and I bought all of them and sold most of them for about $25 a piece and kept one for myself, which I suppose was a crassly commercial thing to do, but they were just sitting there gathering dust, and who am I if I'm not a capitalist? After all, I'm a publisher. But it was interesting that a piece like that by a major American poet, although not a widely known one, had only found print in this rather under-the-counter kind of way. There was nothing hidden about it in the sense that it was forbidden, although I don't know whether he had any permission from Zukowski to do it. But it was badly produced, hardly circulated at all. In fact, the bibliography of Zukowski doesn't even list it. And in that sense was published only in the most insignificant or nugatory way. It was nevertheless a kind of polemical publishing. The person who took the notes obviously felt strongly enough about it to see that it got out. Similarly, a man named Tim Lander, whom I think we know from Lindsay Dobson's catalog, listed some of his work, I was pleased to say. Tim Lander, who lives in Nanaimo, British Columbia, is a kind of street poet who has been producing little books, I mean literally hundreds of them now for years, by writing out by hand on ordinary 8.5 by 11 sheets his poems and thoughts and divagations on various things, Xeroxing them, stapling them together, drawing a little title page drawing, and selling them for a dime or a quarter or 50 cents or whatever you wanted to give him on the street. I mean, there must be, if one tried to collect all of his work, it would probably be impossible because a lot of it's likely been thrown away. But there must be thousands of copies of Tim Lander's stuff circulating around in various places. And one or two libraries have finally caught on to this and started trying to collect it. It's really quite funny seeing people scrabbling after these little pieces, most of which have lined the bottoms of ash cans long ago. A fact I may say about which Tim Lander is extremely philosophical. So publishing can have, private press publishing can have any one of these three equally interesting but quite different kinds of face. And finally, I want to talk about design a little bit, definition of design, and really only to ask the question or to pose the notion that design can be, it seems, one of two things, and increasingly these become disparate. It can be self-referential, that is a design which increasingly calls attention to itself and says, look, I am an artist-designed book. Or it can be an arrangement of received elements, that is to say, the best possible arrangement of text into type onto a page in a form which is easily readable, which is utilitarian. I suppose one of the big problems that we have in talking about private press printing is that a great many people, particularly I think younger printers, have the notion that what they must do is be original. This notion of originality is responsible for a lot of very bad things in our culture. It's a relatively new thought, and I suppose it could arguably come up as something which has happened post-Freud, where suddenly the individual has become a paramount creation of our culture intellectually. And the notion that everyone must do something which nobody else has done leads to some very peculiar cultural gymnastics, not only in the private press world, but everywhere else. I mean, it's possible to be original. The difficulty is to distinguish sometimes between being original and being bizarre, which is often what happens. Bertrand Russell once said, I can't remember exactly how he put it, something about the belief that fashion should be the maker of opinion has some advantages. One is that one need no longer think, and the second is that everyone is within reach of the brightest intelligence. It is a problem when you think about it that a great many people who are working in the arts today really do allow fashion rather than the sense of integrity in the text or the media they're using to dictate what they do. And fashion, of course, being a kind of conspiracy of opinion among one generation, disappears very quickly. If you hope, ironically, for any kind of posterity, fashion is not the way to go about achieving it. So these qualities, these definitions are at the bottom of what I want to say about publishing today. And I think that private press printers are at a crux now, largely because of the advent of the computer. Now, this may be blown out of proportion, I don't know. It's a fairly recent development after all, although it seems now that computer programs and new kinds of computers are coming along so rapidly that every week there's some new development and new possibilities. Recently I heard someone who styled himself a futurist. This apparently is some new career that I was unaware of, on the CBC, which may not exist too far in the future, talking about what people may have in the way of computers in the next 20 years. And he talked about people walking around with little sort of wristwatch arrangements of computers that had everything they needed in the way of their personal diaries and timetables and I guess phone numbers and so forth, as well as perhaps the book they were working on and everything else, all in here, all voice activated. And little things in their glasses, I guess by that time everyone will be blind from looking at computers, so we'll all be wearing them, which would project the screen stuff onto the inside of the lens. Now, I mean, it's bad enough with people driving with cell phones. Can you imagine someone driving with his computer? And anyway, perhaps by that time cars will also be voice activated, I don't know. But, I mean, it's easy to laugh at this kind of thing, but people laughed at men landing on the moon in 1960, and, you know, in 69 they were there. And I'm not suggesting either that this is altogether a bad thing. What I am saying is that people don't seem to make distinctions between what's possible and what's reasonable. And a lot of the things that are happening in publishing particularly seem to me to be unreasonable as far as computer work is concerned. For one thing, the digital book, as I said earlier, if it can be spoken of in that way, is quite a different object than the book which is printed, whether it's printed by letterpress or offset or any other process which we now think of as printing. And that difference is essentially a difference in its relation to the person reading or using the book. And it's also a difference of cultural quality. We are very fond of the word information these days. And one of the things that you hear when you hear about the book going down the tubes is that the computer is replacing the book as the chief purveyor of information. Now, I have never believed that books are chiefly purveyors of information. Yes, of course, they contain information. And some books, like encyclopedia and dictionaries and so forth, are principally conceived to give us information. But there is also a distinction which we have to understand between information and truth. And the two have somehow to be combined in any object which is going to have any cultural resonance for the future. Now, truth, of course, is one of those words that one flings around quite lightly. But by truth, I mean simply that it doesn't give us an object that we can hold at arm's length and simply apply willy-nilly to other objects. But it provides us with something which we can internalize in some way, which we can take into ourselves psychologically, spiritually, however you want to refer to this, and use for our further enrichment and development and for our further thinking about our lives, other people's lives, and so forth. This is not to say, or not even to talk about, the dangers of the computer as a very internalized, very subjective kind of machine. It's not the sort of thing that you can share in the way you can share a book, and that's also a worry. Publishing by its very nature has always been, since the Renaissance, has been an action of community. When you publish a book, you are publishing it for some audience. You may know who that audience is or you may not, but if you don't know who it is, you hope for it. And you try to sell the book on the basis that you have provided something which people need to know, even if they don't yet know they need to know it. That sense of community, that sense of enriching or informing, yes, or developing the sense of a public of which you are a part is a very social, very, if you like, fraternal, sororal, there is such a word, isn't it? Is sororal? Anyway, a very human kind of activity, and a very necessary one. And it's something else which tends to get forgotten when people think about the book developing in all these new ways. I'm aware, by the way, that this whole field, especially if I'm speaking to a room full of private press printers, I know there are a few of you here, is mined with powder kegs, which I could very easily ignite without even realizing I was doing it. And please be assured that I have no intention of trying to blow anybody up. I'm just trying to weave my way through these while drawing attention to a few of them. But one of the powder kegs, of course, is this whole question of the book arts. And it was suggested by Tom Taylor in his introduction to the last issue of Bookways, which came out in '95, that the via media, that is the publication of the private press book, which was essentially a text, well dressed, had become something which was no longer possible to talk about, because the book had gone in two quite distinct separate directions. One was the computer, and the other was the book arts book, the one-of-a-kind book, or the artist's book, as we now call it. And the artist's book, it seems to me, has a number of problems. I think the problem principally is that we think of it as a book, and it really isn't a book much of the time. It's something else. It is an artwork, perhaps a kind of kinetic sculpture or an interactive sculpture. But many of them are simply not books, at least in the sense that I understand them. And ultimately I have to refer to my own knowledge or sense of what a book is and what a book should be. Many book arts books or artist books are very beautiful things, but I don't find in them the kind of utilitarian purpose that I get from a well-printed book with a text and illustrations and some kind of balance, or even a book that's all illustrations that is intended to give me a cross-section of an artist's work or a group of artists. That kind of work is again something which has been freed by the computer perhaps to be done. And I think a lot of people who are doing book arts today and who are producing artists' books in very limited editions probably wouldn't even have thought of doing them in the 50s simply because there was much work to be done in what we might call the conventional book, the via media. There was a lot of publishing that needed to be done and could be done only by private presses. And here's where the marketplace comes in. In a world in which commercial printing was principally done by letterpress, the private press printer could see himself as an adjunct to it. And he could typically take on books which the private press, or the commercial press rather, either didn't want to print or couldn't really afford to print because the population which would be interested in it was too small. Some of these would have come under the heading of what I've referred to as polemical publishing. For example, in San Francisco in the late 40s and early 50s, when Lawrence Ferlinghetti at City Lights Bookshop was publishing little chapbooks of poets like Gregory Corso and Allen Ginsberg and himself and a lot of other people, that poetry simply hadn't appeared anywhere except in manuscripts and sort of tape recordings at readings. It was very much an underground movement of poetry, but as we now know, 40 years on, much of it has moved into the mainstream of American poetic history and has had an enormous influence on contemporary poets since, particularly in North America, but in Europe and England as well. Now those poems finally were gathered together and published in some kind of anthology form in 1960 by Donald Allen in a book called The New American Poetry, 1945 to 1960, which arguably is the most influential anthology of poetry in English that's appeared in the last half of this century. It made available for the first time writing which turned the conventions of American poetry particularly, but poetry in English really, right on its head, and suggested a completely new way of writing poetry. Whether you like it or not, it has had a tremendous effect, and it has, at its best, injected a new kind of, well, shall I say, a new kind of plasma into the lifeblood of the culture. Why not keep a metaphor intact for once? It's made the reading of poetry allowed, something which is fashionable again, probably too fashionable in some ways. Most people who go to poetry readings look as if they're in church, and half the time it's really awkward, you know, standing in front of an audience reading your poetry and seeing people nodding off or looking at you with kind of glazed piety. It's a remarkable experience, and I'm not sure that it serves poetry very well. Nevertheless, it is a kind of faddish adherence to text that we are stuck with, and it probably doesn't do any harm when you get right down to it. The kind of poetry that's produced that way, and the short stories and essays of people like Wendell Berry and Garrick Walker and other writers who have since become household names almost in American and Canadian literature, was an important publishing step. And often it drew attention to the writing of these people such that commercial publishers would then approach the writers and say, well, okay, we've seen a few of your poems, we think you're good, submit a text, and then they would move into the mainstream. That increasingly has disappeared over the last 20 years. And I suppose the one thing that I would try to do if I were to make a call to arms, isn't it usually called a clarion call to arms? I don't know. To private press printers, is that they should spend more time thinking about finding texts which need to be published and bringing them out in a readable form. I really do think that publishing commercially being what it is now, there is a real need for new writers to be discovered by private presses and got out there as reasonably as possible. And by reasonable, I don't only mean readable, I also mean approachable by people who don't have very much money. I mean, it's all very well to publish a collection of poems which have appeared in 50 other editions at $200 because you've got an illustrator to do them and taken a lot of time and used handmade paper. That's fine. People can still read them somewhere else. But I think it's irresponsible to produce poetry like that, poetry that's new rather, and poetry that hasn't been approached anywhere else in editions which are too expensive for people to read. It just doesn't seem to be sensible. There is a great deal of, oh what the hell, I'll use the word, there's a great deal of fun to be had in publishing cheaply but well poetry or prose which you consider to be worthwhile. But it requires an approach to the book and an approach to text which a great many private press printers no longer have. And this is my other clarion cry. And that is that increasingly as the computer and as this information madness takes over for us, we need as private press printers and readers and collectors to become more culturally literate and to realize that we are at the, not the end point I hope, but at the present point, at an ultimate point so far, of cultural history, which includes everything that's gone before. This is a very strange century that we live in. It seems to me to be the only century in which we have decided en bloc to reject the past. I mean, if you go through cultural history, you'll discover, for example, that the Renaissance threw out the Gothic as being old hat. You know, they wanted nothing to do with it, and they were in for new ideas. And in the 17th and 18th century, they whitewashed over mosaics that we now consider to, we're carefully restoring and consider to be great objects of art. That in the 18th century, the heroic couplet replaced the sonnet, which had been arguably the greatest purveyor of lyric thought in English, in favor of the heroic couplet. And in the 19th century, the Romantics threw out the heroic couplet, brought back the sonnet, and refused to have anything to do with Augustan thought. But you know, so there's a process of hitting back against one's fathers, in effect. I mean, many of us are old enough to remember that when we were in school or university, the worst thing you could call anybody was a Victorian. But of course, Victorian literature is now once more in fashion. People are interested in Victorian writing, they're interested in the poetry, they're interested in the painting and the social history of it, and they've discovered that actually some of these guys knew what they were talking about. You know, they were pretty good. But for a long time in this century, the Victorians were seen as repressive idiots who had absolutely nothing to offer, and they were prudish to a degree and completely untenable to anyone with a modern sensibility. It's also true, though, to remember that these earlier ages didn't throw out everything else completely. For example, in Shakespeare's time, in the early part of his life when he was only a child, they discovered the beginnings of the ruins of Pompeii. The farmer was digging around in his field in about the 1570s and discovered a statue's head, and they realized that there was a whole bunch of stuff down there that had been buried and started in a very amateur and disorganized way to dig. And this created, over the next couple of centuries, in fact, an enormous fad for Roman antiquity. You have only to look at a number of Roman authors who were suddenly resurrected and retranslated in Shakespeare's lifetime. Chapman's Homer, for example, that's a Greek one. But Golding's Ovid, the translation of the Metamorphoses was pulled out at about that time. Pope retranslated a lot of Latin writers. Catullus was retranslated, and all of a sudden these authors were brought into English. And Shakespeare's Roman plays, Coriolanus and Julius Caesar and all the rest of them, were largely a response to an avid appetite, which was nothing more than a fad, really, in many ways, of the Elizabethan public for plays about Roman antiquity, because it was faddish. So it wasn't that the Elizabethans, in throwing out the Middle Ages and the Gothic, were throwing out the past. They were just throwing out, as it were, their immediate antecedents, which every child does when he reaches adolescence, right? I mean, it's a natural human process, and it happens in macrocosm culturally. Similarly, the Romantics, while they threw out the 18th century, also revived the medieval, you know, and you had the pre-Raphaelites and the lust after the Middle Ages and the chivalry and everything that Keats writes about, for example, and that Tennyson wrote about later. So again, they weren't discarding the past en masse, they were simply selective about it, and they were interested in getting rid of their immediate forebears. But we in the 20th century have to a large extent thrown everything out. And there are reasons for this. Freud, I think, is one. Jung is another. That attention to the individual, to the psyche, to the personal memory, to race or cultural memory, as Jung refers to it, is a very plausible, if not good, reason for being more concerned with ourselves and with looking inward than perhaps with looking at the overall picture with ourselves as one of the cogs in it. And similarly, the First World War particularly destroyed practically every illusion that existed in the build-up of the social structure at that time, such that when Eliot wrote The Wasteland in 1921, his poem really summed up perfectly what had happened. He said, in referring to the past, he said, "These fragments have I shored against my ruins," that the entire civilization had been left shattered. And his poetry, which is fragmented deliberately, pulls quotations from all over the place, including that one, incidentally, is intended to be a kind of a defense against the fragmentation of everything around. And it's interesting to note that in, for example, the graphic arts, the collage and the mobile, both of which are in a sense fragmentations as structures, came into great use in the 20s and 30s after the First World War. I think that's not a coincidence. It's simply a different response to the same problem. So in a century in which we are so drawn into our own psyches and our own thoughts and our own ways of thinking about the world, and where looking back we have that huge barrier of the cataclysm of the 1914-18 war between us and what appears to have been, in retrospect, civilization in the Edwardian and Victorian periods, that we have also rejected the past and just said, well, okay, we can't get at it even if we want to. It's not relevant. This is a new age. We are discovering ourselves. We're discovering the mind. We know everything, you know? This has been, I think, first of all, the cry of the young all the way through history. And it's also been the cry of most cultures that had any kind of stasis at their foundations. Economically, we have been somewhat up and down through this century, but in technology, we've been very solid. We've been steadily developing, particularly in the sciences. And I think that's given us a kind of ungovernable conceit about our ability to deal with everything around us and protect ourselves from any problems. I think that in earlier periods, you got the same kind of self-satisfaction. You certainly had it in the Elizabethan period. You only have to look through an anthology of Elizabethan poetry to see how many second-rate odes were written to Elizabeth and to the Crown of England and to England as the great savior of the world. And of course, in the 19th century, the Great Exhibition in 1851 in Victorian England was hailed by everybody around, even the most radical people, as the substance of which civilization is made. You know, this was the absolute avatar of the civilized life. We can do anything. This was the cry. And some of the worst poetry ever written was written by some of the best poets in English about that actual problem. People become immediate adolescents, it seems, when they're faced with their own self-satisfaction. Maybe that's what adolescence is all about. Well, I think the book has arrived at that kind of self-satisfaction at this point in its career. And I really do enjoin, and one of the reasons I'm teaching this course at Simon Fraser and writing a lengthy essay about this is to attempt to get to a larger audience, my conviction that the book has to be re-examined and that private press printers now are in a position, let's look at it as an opportunity, not as a responsibility, are now in a position to be able to reconstruct the role of the press as a publisher of new work, new poetry, new short stories, new novels, new polemics of whatever kind, in order to provide, not necessarily as an antagonistic element against commercial publishing, but as a real mainstream of culture, to provide a development of belles lettres, a development of writing and literature and thought, which simply cannot find its place in the information marketplace, which we find our place in today. Commercial publishers, even 10 years ago, were much more flexible about the kind of books they would publish than they are now. I feel, I've talked about this a couple of times in slightly different ways to groups of writers about publishing, because since Jan and I have a press, when I go to writers' conferences, that's one of the things I end up talking about, as well as my own writing. And it's interesting that in Canada, it's not easy to get published as a poet, but it's possible still. In the States, it's virtually impossible, for reasons which I suppose are apparent. And even houses which 10 years ago, like Copper Canyon Press in Washington, used to publish a lot of new poetry, are now going for the safe, established names, because they've got themselves in an economic position, which I don't pretend entirely to understand, I have to say, but they've got themselves into an economic position where they simply cannot publish something which isn't going to sell out almost at once. A book comes out in hardback, and within 6 weeks it's remaindered. And it comes out in paper a little while later, and after a very short time, it's remaindered too. If it doesn't sell, it's gone. So there's no sense of finding something which is really worthwhile and keeping it there. The problem, I think, is, in many of these houses, that well, first of all, that the ownership has changed. A lot of them are now owned by corporations who are not interested at all in publishing. They're only interested in a write-off. And they buy companies like Random House and Ryerson and you know, houses, Knopf and so on, houses that were once in the mainstream of publishing in the States and Canada, and they are interested only in the accountants, what the accountants have to say about the bottom line. What happens finally is that the editors and publishers become more marketers than editors or publishers anymore. We were talking about this yesterday. And that editors and marketers don't really sleep together very well. It's a difficult thing for one person to be both. Recently, for example, in San Francisco, a friend of ours approached a publishing house called Chronicle House in San Francisco, which has in the past published some very fine editions, reprint editions of private press books on wood engraving. They're very fond of wood engraving, or were, with the idea that they might publish a trade edition of a book that Barbarian Press published 2 years ago called Endgrain, which was a collection of engravings of North American wood engravers. 5 years ago, we were told by the Chronicle House people, they would have taken it without even thinking twice. Now they were enjoined by the people who had bought them out, which was a big Japanese car firm, that unless the book would sell 100,000 copies, they weren't interested. That was it. It had to sell 100,000 copies. And I think probably that Endgrain would not sell 100,000 copies, but I think it would probably sell 50. You know, there are a lot of universities, schools, and so on that would be interested in such a book simply because of its range and the fact that it shows work by a wide number of artists who aren't otherwise available to be seen. However, that's by the by. We have, I think, found another publisher who is very much just one step above private press, but in the marketplace, who's willing to take it on. And if that all comes together, there will be a trade edition of the book, but a much smaller run, perhaps, than otherwise would have been the case. This, to me, is not a question of money at all. It's a question of an interesting and somewhat depressing development in publishing, which means that where publishers in the past have been selectors of what they felt to be useful and needful for the culture so that they could present them to the public with a real avidity, with a real sense that they were doing something worthwhile, they have been changed from that, whether or not they're the same person, to people who have to consider whether it'll sell, whether it's a unit that will work in the market before they consider whether it's worth publishing. And that's a terrible inversion of what publishing should be. I may even say perversion of what publishing should be. Nevertheless, it's with us and we have to live with it. And there are, thank God, enough publishers who still care about books, that good books, of course, do get published still. It is possible to find in any bookshop large numbers of books by large commercial publishers which have somehow snuck through this barrier and have become published anyway. But my advice increasingly to you is if you see such a book, grab it fast because it probably won't be around very long. They do tend to disappear. So I want to sum this up by suggesting two things. First of all, that the private presses need to rethink their relation to the book as a structure and to their need to produce something which is useful for the culture as opposed to their need to produce something which is exemplary of their own psyches, their own artistic creativity, their own originality. Originality is something which can be found just as much in tradition as it can be found in any kind of wild experiment. If you publish a book using one size of type on white paper with black ink and no illustrations, and you set it beautifully, and you edit the text beautifully, and you publish it well and sensibly, you have created something which is original. Original not in the sense that it's bizarre or new-fashioned, but original in a sense that it has to do with origins. That's, to me, what originality should be. And origins don't belong to any one of us. They belong to all of us. It's simply occasionally it's the chance for one of us who happens to be working in a press to reach down and pull something out of it. But we don't keep it for ourselves. We show it to everybody else. That's what publishing should be. And the second thing is that private press printers should also, I think, really re-examine their sense of what the history of the book is and what the history of printing as a social event has been. Books cannot be examples of individual artistic merit, no matter how fine they may be, and still remain books. They have to be social acts. They have to be purveyors of thought to anybody who comes along to look at them in such a way that they are useful, practical, approachable by anybody who wants them, and in such a way that they indicate, I think, a profound humility on the part of the printer and the publisher for what he has found. Really, publishing is a kind of discovery. And if the discovery can be shared, it's publishing and bookmaking of the best. If it can't be, it's something else. It may be a good thing, but it's not book publishing. And it seems to me that's what private presses have started out to do, and what they should continue to do at all costs. So thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions, if anyone would like to, or brickbats or arguments. If anyone would like to bring them up, that would be fine.
I'm just curious about something. I get the impression you advocate very strongly the idea of, first of all, original material that might not otherwise have an audience, and secondly, affordable so that it can be disseminated. I'm just curious, your own private press, how this is manifested in what you do.
There is a problem there, which I didn't get into because it would have been another 10 minutes. In our own press, we have produced books of poetry which we've kept as low as we can keep in price. Now, for example, we published new poetry by a couple of American poets a couple of years ago, a book called Believe to Cause Night. The lowest price we could possibly go without being bankrupt ourselves was $50 a copy, which is a lot. Although if you go into a bookstore and look at a new novel or a new, a large nonfiction book, you're going to be paying $40, $45, $50 for those. So nowadays it's not that far out of line. And it did have, arguably, the whatever aesthetic value we'd managed to put into it by printing it as well as we could. We tried to make it a beautiful book. Now at that price we were basically covering our costs, and that was all. I'm sorry? 150. Again, that was in consultation with the writers. They figured that's what they could sell. I think they were modest. In fact, the book sold out very quickly, and we had a lot of response for more. We now have another manuscript of theirs, and we'll make the edition bigger. And we're going to try to keep the cost down. But again, you see, this is now 6 years later, and it's going to be more expensive. It's nothing. That's a difficulty. Even if you buy relatively cheap paper, especially if you're hand setting, as we do, the amount of time you put into it and the amount of time the press work takes undeniably costs more. But that same amount put in terms of commercial publishing is just a drop in the bucket. Nobody would pay any attention to it. The trouble is they won't do that kind of work, so somebody else has to. If there was some way of producing a book which was beautiful in some arguable way, readable, utilitarian, the things that I've been espousing here, and to get the price down to $10 or $15 a copy, I'd gladly do it. But I don't see any way of doing that right now. You'd have to use paper that was going to fall apart. You couldn't sew the book. The list goes on and on. I don't know what to do about that.
No, I was just wondering if you were factoring in the pragmatic with this exhortation, or whether you were really thinking that other printers should be more altruistic and essentially do it at a loss or something, because maybe for some people it wasn't a source of revenue for them. It was,
No, I think who does this kind of printing to some level has to be altruistic. There's no way around it. I was rather delighted to discover a couple of years ago when some friend of ours who was an accountant and a professor of economics told us that we've been living below the poverty line for the last 15 years. We weren't aware of it. There are clearly statistics out there which have nothing to do with people getting on with what they love. And I think that's an important point, that in doing what we do, Jan and I are doing work we love to do. And so there are compensations which go beyond the financial. We have enough to get by on. We have 2 kids, they're fed and clothed and so forth. We pay our bills. But we don't have the kind of income that statistics tell us we have to be, middle-class people and living in a reasonable life. It's a different worldview, I suppose. So it is altruistic to that extent. Engrain, the book I mentioned before, wood engravings, took us 9 years to do. We did a couple of other books in the meantime, small ones in the meantime, but that was the main work the press did for that long. It was a big book to be done the way we did it. And when it sold, it was very gratifying because we got lots of money all at once, So our income tax, of course, shot way up for that year and so forth. But when we worked out with this same accountant friend roughly what we'd been working for, and through the years it was something like 30 cents an hour. It was ridiculous the amount of money we made. But that doesn't mean anything. And I'm not trying to be altruistic or silly about it. Of course, one has to live, and I know that. But what I mean is that it isn't, in our terms, necessary. The satisfaction of the work obviates to some extent the income that we don't get.
No, I was wondering if there was a disparity between the ideal and the reality of running a press.
I think we've been lucky, and that we've managed to keep it pretty close together. There is always a gap. I mean, we'd love to do all the books on handmade paper, but we can't. We can't afford it. That's, I suppose, an ideal. Our feelings, I'm speaking only for us now, our feelings about when we started the press haven't really changed in this particular, that we wanted to keep the craft alive. We wanted to be able to pass on the way we do things, hand setting type, using hand presses, using dampened paper, making ready, all the crafts that had been developed over centuries and which are now not lost but certainly disappearing. And we wanted to produce books that we wanted to read, that we couldn't get any other way, the best way we could. Those ideals I think we've kept to pretty much. We won't begin to publish all the books we'd like to publish because it's too damn slow. And I may say that I have no particular objection to using other forms of publishing if need be. I recently designed a book with computer type for somebody else as a job, as a designer. And I was delighted to see the kind of flexibility that these computer programs have. It is possible to produce a very nice looking page of type and a book which stands very nicely on the shelf. But it's not something that I'll get into for a Barbarian press, partly for financial reasons and partly because it would go against this adherence to the craft that's very important to us. But it's not, I'm not a Luddite, and I think I am an idealist. I know that one's supposed to apologize for that these days, but I don't. I think it's true. I think you have to be to do this kind of work in some way.